They told me to make him feel special. That was the instruction. No one ever explained what that meant. Not really. And no one ever told me how far it was supposed to go. I had to find that out on my own. That one sentence, it ended up costing me more than just my job. It cost me my trust in people. It cost me the belief that rules are there to protect everyone equally. I'm still trying to figure out how to get that back. My name is Sarah. I'm 35. For a long time, I was a waitress. I was good at it. I was the kind of person who showed up on time, who did the work, who followed the rules. I learned every item on the menu. I knew which wine paired with which dish, and I never mixed up an order. I learned early on that in the service industry, you have to be careful, you have to be precise, because if something goes wrong, it's always easier to blame the person serving the table than the person paying the bill. So I kept my head down. I did my job well. I didn't cause problems. I knew that being seen as difficult was a quick way to lose shifts, or worse. Conflict was something to be avoided at all costs. The restaurant where I worked was one of those places, high-end. The kind of place where your status got you a better table, a quieter corner, a bottle of wine that wasn't on the list. We had regulars, and then we had special guests. That's what management called them. Leonard Hale was a special guest. He wasn't just a regular, he was an institution. He was a millionaire, someone well known in the city. When he came in, the whole atmosphere shifted. The hosts would stand a little straighter. The managers would suddenly appear at the front. It was a silent, well-practiced drill. Management would get this look on their faces, a kind of nervous energy mixed with deference. His presence meant a very profitable night, but it also meant everything had to be perfect. The first time I was assigned his section, my manager David pulled me aside. He told me that Mr. Hale was very important to the restaurant. He said my only job was to make sure he felt special. I'm a literal person. I like clear instructions. So I asked what that meant. Specifically, did he have allergies I should know about? Did he prefer a certain pace for his meal? David just smiled. He told me I was one of their best, that I would figure it out. He said to just use my judgment. That was the first red flag. Use your judgment is just a way of saying, if it goes right, we take the credit. If it goes wrong, it's your fault. I'd heard that before. It's corporate language for we don't want to be responsible. So I treated him like the most important person in the room. I was attentive, but not intrusive. I was polite. I made sure his glass was never empty. I anticipated his needs before he had to ask. I did my job perfectly. At the end of the night, my manager was happy. He said Mr. Hale had a good experience and had complimented my service. I felt relieved. I thought I had passed some kind of test. I thought, okay, I understand now. Special just means perfect. I could do perfect. Leonard started requesting my section. At first, it was a compliment. It meant I was doing a good job. It meant bigger tips. It meant my manager saw me as reliable. In a job where your income can fluctuate so much, reliability is currency. Then the expectations started to change. Slowly. So slowly you could almost convince yourself you were imagining it. It wasn't one big thing. It was 100 little things. He would arrive without a reservation and expect his usual table to be free. And it always was. If a couple was already seated there, a manager would go over, apologize profusely, and move them. They'd get a free bottle of champagne for their trouble. Everyone was made happy, except maybe the people who had followed the rules and made a reservation. He expected me to know his drink order, his meal preferences, even how he liked his steak cooked on a particular day, which seemed to change based on his mood. I learned his habits. I had to. It was part of making him feel special. I kept a little notebook, a mental one of his preferences. It became a side job within my job. One night, he stayed late. Long after the last guest had left, the kitchen was closed, the busboys had finished. The other servers were cashing out and heading home. I was still standing by his table. Because he was still there, finishing his brandy. My manager was at the front watching. He didn't tell me I could leave. He didn't tell Mr. Hale the restaurant was closing. He just waited. And so I waited. I stood there, feeling my feet ache, thinking about the last bus I was about to miss. It made me uncomfortable. I had a life outside of that place. But a special guest doesn't operate on the same schedule as everyone else. The rules of time didn't seem to apply to him. When he finally got up to leave, he didn't say, "Thank you for the extra time." He didn't acknowledge that I had stayed an hour and a half after closing. He just put the payment on the table and walked out. The tip was very large. It was meant to be a replacement for courtesy, a transaction. The next day, my manager praised me. He said I handled the situation perfectly. He said that's what it takes to provide top-tier service. He saw the big tip on the receipt and saw it as a victory for the restaurant. I wanted to ask him, what if I couldn't stay? What if I had a child to pick up from a sitter? What if I had another commitment? But I didn't, because I knew what the answer would be. It wouldn't be an answer. It would be a look, a disappointed look, the kind that says, "You're not a team player." And then maybe my shifts would get cut. Maybe I wouldn't be assigned the good sections anymore. Maybe I'd be stuck with the Tuesday lunch shift for the next 6 months. So I said nothing. I just nodded. This became a pattern. He would stay late and I was expected to stay with him. It was just part of the job of serving Leonard Hale. It was an unspoken, unwritten rule. Then came the familiarity. He started calling me Sarah, which was fine. Most regulars did. But the way he said it felt different. It was softer, like he was saying a private name, not just a name on my tag. He'd ask me about my day, not in the polite, small talk way. It was more personal, more probing. He'd ask what I did on my days off, if I was seeing anyone. He asked me once what my rent was. I was shocked by that question. I just mumbled something about it being manageable. I would give short, vague answers. I tried to steer the conversation back to the menu, to his wine, to anything else. My job was to be a professional, and this felt like it was crossing into a territory I didn't want to visit. But he was persistent. He seemed to enjoy trying to get a reaction out of me. I felt my professionalism being eroded, one tiny question at a time. Each question was a little test of my boundaries. I mentioned it to another waitress, Maria. I asked her if she thought it was weird that he asked about my personal life. She just shrugged. She told me he was probably just a lonely old man. She said for the kind of money he spends here, he probably thinks he can ask whatever he wants. She told me to be careful. It wasn't a warning about him, it was a warning for me. A warning that complaining could hurt my standing. So I tried to be even more careful. I kept a professional distance. I made my answers even shorter, more bland. I became an expert in the non-answer, but the more I pulled back, the more he seemed to push. It was like a game where he was making up the rules as he went, and I was the only one playing who could lose. One evening, he was there with a group of business associates. He was holding court, telling stories, laughing loudly. The whole table was focused on him. He called me over to the table to order another round of drinks. As I stood there, he put his hand on my arm. Just for a second. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't a grab. It was casual. Too casual. The way you'd touch a friend or a family member. It was an act of ownership. He didn't even look at me. He just kept talking to his friends, his hand resting on my arm. He introduced me to his friends. He didn't use my name. He just said, "This is my favorite waitress. She takes such good care of me." His friends all smiled at me. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a knowing smile. I felt like I was on display, a part of his collection of special things. I smiled back. The fake customer service smile you learn on day one. I said it was my pleasure to serve them. I gently pulled my arm away as I turned to leave. It had to be smooth, natural. An act of retreat disguised as a normal movement. I walked away from that table, and my heart was pounding. My arm felt strange where he had touched it. It was just a touch, a simple touch on the arm. I told myself I was overreacting. Millions of people touch each other's arms every day, but it didn't feel like an overreaction. It felt like a line had been crossed. A very subtle line that only I could feel. He had established a new level of intimacy, a new rule, without asking. And he had done it in public, making it impossible for me to object without causing a scene. When I went to my manager later, after the party had left, I tried to bring it up. I didn't know how. I didn't want to sound like a complainer. I found David counting the receipts in his office. I stood in the doorway. I said that Mr. Hale was getting a little, familiar. I used that word specifically, familiar. It sounded less accusatory than inappropriate. My manager didn't look at me. He was busy with the paperwork. His focus was on the numbers. He just said that Mr. Hale is from an older generation, that he's just being friendly, harmless. He told me not to take it the wrong way. He said Mr. Hale was the restaurant's most important client. He reminded me how much revenue the man brought in. And then he said it again, the phrase that was starting to feel like a cage. Just make him feel special, Sarah. You're doing a great job. That was it. The conversation was over. He looked down at his papers, a clear signal that I was dismissed. He had not listened. Or he had, and he had chosen to ignore it. He had chosen the money over my discomfort. I felt completely alone. It was a terrible, sinking feeling. I realized then that making him feel special didn't have any boundaries. The boundaries were whatever Leonard Hale decided they were on any given night. And my job was to accept them. My manager had just confirmed it. My discomfort was a small price to pay for Mr. Hale's happiness and his money. The job wasn't just about serving food anymore. It was about managing his expectations, his moods, his need for a certain kind of attention. And I was the one responsible for it all. After that, things got worse. The unspoken rules kept expanding. He started to schedule his dinners around my shifts. His assistant would call the restaurant and ask when I was working next. At first, my manager presented this to me as a good thing. He really likes you, Sarah. He's coming in on Thursday because you're on the schedule. It didn't feel like a good thing. It felt like I was being followed. It felt like my work schedule was no longer my own. Then he started bringing me gifts, small things, a box of expensive chocolates, a bottle of perfume. I couldn't accept them. It was against restaurant policy. More than that, it felt wrong. It felt like another transaction, like he was trying to buy something. I told him I couldn't accept gifts from customers. I said it politely. I thanked him, but I refused. He looked hurt, genuinely hurt. He told me it was just a token of his appreciation. I took the gifts to my manager. I explained that I wasn't comfortable with it. David sighed. He looked tired. He looked at me like I was the problem. He told me not to offend Mr. Hale. He told me to just take the gifts and be discreet about it. He said it was easier than having to deal with an unhappy VIP. So I started taking the gifts. I would say thank you, and then I would put them in my locker. Most of them I just gave away. I didn't want them. They felt heavy. The other staff noticed. They saw the special treatment. They saw him asking for me. They saw the gifts. Some of them were resentful. They thought I was getting special favors. They didn't see the pressure behind it. They didn't see the knot in my stomach every time he walked through the door. I felt isolated from my own co-workers. I was in a special category just like him, but not in a good way. One night, he asked me to sit down with him. It was late again. The place was almost empty. He was at his usual table, and he gestured to the chair opposite him. I froze. That was a line I knew I couldn't cross. Sitting with a customer, while on duty, that was a fireable offense. I told him I couldn't. I said I was still working. He smiled. He told me to relax. He said he would make sure it was okay with my manager. He said he wanted to talk to me, not as a waitress, but as a person. I looked over at the manager's station. David was there. He was watching us. He saw the empty chair. He saw Mr. Hale gesturing to it. David did nothing. He didn't come over. He didn't shake his head. He just looked away. He looked away. That was my answer. That was my instruction. He was leaving it up to me. He was leaving me to deal with it. He was washing his hands of the entire situation. I felt a cold dread spread through me. I told Mr. Hale again that I was sorry, but I had to keep working. I started wiping down a nearby table that was already perfectly clean. I just needed to be doing something, to be in motion. His smile faded. He didn't say anything else to me for the rest of the night. He was quiet, moody. When he left, the tip was much smaller than usual. The next day, David pulled me aside. He didn't mention the tip, but I knew that's what it was about. He told me that Mr. Hale had seemed a bit off last night. He asked if everything was okay. I was honest. I told him that Mr. Hale had asked me to sit down with him and that I had declined. David got that same tired look again. He rubbed his forehead. He told me that maybe I should have just sat down for a minute, that it wouldn't have hurt anything. He said it was important to keep Mr. Hale happy. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was telling me to break a fundamental rule of the job, a rule that would get any other server fired on the spot. He was telling me that the rules didn't apply when it came to Leonard Hale. And that meant the rules protecting me didn't apply either. I asked him, so what am I supposed to do? What are the rules here? He didn't have an answer. He just said to Sarah, don't be difficult. Just keep him happy. It's not that hard. It wasn't that hard. I went into the break room after that conversation and I just sat there. I felt like I was losing my mind. I was being told to do a job, but no one would tell me what the job was. I was being held responsible for a powerful man's happiness, and my own feelings, my own safety didn't matter. Every boundary I tried to set was seen as me being difficult. Every time I tried to maintain a professional line, I was accused of not doing my job properly. The phrase "make him feel special" had become a threat. It meant do whatever he wants or you'll be the one who pays the price. I felt trapped. I needed the job. I had bills to pay. I couldn't just walk away, so I stayed. And I tried to navigate the impossible situation I was in. But I was starting to understand that there was no way to win. The game was rigged. The pressure kept building. It was in the way my managers looked at me whenever Mr. Hale was in the restaurant. It was in the whispers from other staff members. It was in the way he looked at me now. His gaze had changed. It wasn't just friendly anymore. There was an expectation in his eyes, an assumption of intimacy that I had never agreed to. He would make comments, softly, so only I could hear them. He'd compliment my appearance. He'd say things like, "You look tired today. Are you getting enough rest?" It sounded like concern, but it felt like surveillance. He started touching my hand when I would set down a plate or refill his water. Little fleeting touches. So quick that if I were to complain, I would sound crazy. He touched my hand for a second. Who would take that seriously? But it was happening, again and again. It was a constant, low-level violation of my personal space. I stopped mentioning it to anyone. What was the point? I knew what my manager would say. I knew he would tell me I was imagining it or that it was harmless. I started to feel a constant sense of anxiety at work. Every time the front door opened, I would brace myself, hoping it wasn't him. My performance started to suffer. I, who had always been so precise, started making small mistakes. I forgot a side order. I brought the wrong wine. My manager noticed. He told me I needed to focus. He said I seemed distracted. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that I was distracted because he and the restaurant had put me in an impossible position. But I just apologized. I said it wouldn't happen again. I felt like I was breaking apart from the inside. I was trying so hard to hold on to my professionalism, to who I was, but the pressure was too much. I started to think about quitting. But then I would look at my bank account, I would think about my rent, and I would feel that same sense of being trapped all over again. I felt like I was failing. I, Sarah Mitchell, the responsible one, the one who always followed the rules, was failing. It took me a long time to realize that I wasn't the one who was failing. The system was, the rules were, the people in charge were failing me. They had created a situation where one person's comfort was more important than another person's safety, and I was the one who was expected to absorb all the risk. The turning point came on a Saturday night. The restaurant was packed. It was loud and chaotic, the way it always is on a weekend. Mr. Hale was there, at his usual table. He wasn't with business associates this time. He was with a woman. She was much younger than him. I was relieved. I thought that with a guest at his table, he would be on his best behavior. I thought I would get a break. I was wrong. His behavior was worse. It was like he was performing for her, showing off his power, his influence. He was more demanding than usual. He sent a dish back because it was not quite right. He complained that the wine wasn't chilled to the exact temperature he preferred. I handled it all with my usual professional calm. I apologized. I replaced the dish. I brought a new bottle of wine. I was a machine of good service. But he kept escalating. He called me over to the table. He asked me a question about the dessert menu. As I leaned in slightly to hear him over the noise of the restaurant, he reached out and put his hand on the small of my back. It wasn't a touch. It was a firm, possessive placement. His hand just rested there. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I could feel the heat of his hand through the thin fabric of my uniform. It was not on my arm. It was not on my hand. It was on my lower back. It was an unmistakably intimate, controlling gesture, and he did it in front of his guest, in front of a dining room full of people. He kept talking about the dessert menu as if nothing was happening. His guest didn't seem to notice, or she chose not to. I tried to pull away, but his hand was firm. He was holding me there. I felt a surge of panic. My mind was racing. What do I do? What can I do? If I make a scene, I get fired. If I say something, he will deny it and I will be called a liar. If I do nothing, I am letting this happen. I felt hundreds of eyes on me, even if no one was actually looking. I felt the weight of my manager's words, keep him happy. This was not happy. This was something else entirely. I looked up, and my eyes met the eyes of a man at the next table. He was there with his wife. He had seen it. He had seen the whole thing. He saw my face. He saw the hand on my back. He had a look on his face. It was a look of shock, and then anger. He didn't say anything. He just watched. In that moment, something inside me snapped. The part of me that had been carefully managing this situation for months, the part that had been swallowing my discomfort, the part that had been telling myself to just get through it, it broke. I took a step back, a sudden sharp movement that forced him to remove his hand. I didn't say a word, I just looked at him. My professional smile was gone. My face was a blank mask. I said, "I will be back to take your dessert order." My voice was cold. It was a voice he had never heard from me before. I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I walked step by deliberate step back towards the kitchen. The space his hand had occupied on my back was cold. It felt like a patch of skin had gone numb. A dead zone where the pressure had been. I did not run. I walked, my steps measured and even, the same way I walked when carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Each footfall was a silent, well-practiced drill. To do anything else, to stumble, to hurry, to look back, would be to admit that he had broken something. I went to the service station, a small alcove of stainless steel and dark wood hidden from the main dining room. My hands were shaking, not violently, but with a fine, high-frequency tremor that made the polished silverware I began to roll into linen napkins clink together with a sound like tiny, frantic bells. I focused on the task, fold the linen, place the fork, the knife, roll it tight, secure it, place it in the bin. My movements were mechanical, a desperate retreat into the familiar patterns of the job. I could feel him watching me. I didn't have to see him. It was a weight on my back, a prickling heat that was the opposite of the cold spot his hand had left. He was not a man who was used to having a hand pushed away. He was a man who expected the world to yield to his touch. From my station, I had a sliver of a view of the dining room. I saw the woman at the adjacent table, the witness. She was no longer looking at me with shock. Her expression had settled into something quieter, a look of grim, knowing solidarity. She met my gaze for a fraction of a second, and in that brief connection, I felt a flicker of validation that was almost painful. She knew. She had seen it for what it was. Her husband was looking at his menu, oblivious, but she saw it. After a few minutes that felt like an hour, I saw Mr. Hale rise from his table. He moved with an unhurried grace, adjusting his cuffs. He didn't look in my direction again. He walked to the front where David was already waiting with his coat, smiling his placid, professional smile. As Hale passed the woman's table, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. A king acknowledging a minor courtier. He was re-establishing the order of things. The woman's husband caught my eye as they prepared to leave a few minutes later. He flagged me down, his face polite. "The check, please." As I ran his card, he leaned in slightly. "My wife and I thought you handled that situation with a great deal of professionalism." His voice was low, meant only for me. It was a small thing. It was everything. "Thank you, sir," I said, my own voice tight. I handed him the slip to sign. He added a generous tip, but that wasn't what I saw. In the small space above the signature line, he had written, "Go." We saw that. I slid the slip into my apron, the paper feeling both heavy and fragile. It was proof. A piece of evidence in a trial that would never happen. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I cleared my remaining tables, ran my end-of-night reports, and cashed out my tips. The other servers gave me a wide berth. They had seen Hale leave without his usual drawn-out farewell. They had seen David's jaw tighten. In the fragile ecosystem of the restaurant, I had become a source of instability. I was a problem. Just as I was about to clock out, David appeared at the door to the back office. "Sarah, my office." It wasn't a request. The office was small and smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. David didn't sit behind his desk. He leaned against it, creating the illusion of a casual chat. It was a posture designed to disarm, but all it did was put him between me and the door. He didn't look at me. He was busy examining a microscopic stain on his perfectly pressed shirt. "So," he began, his voice smooth. That was an unfortunate end to the evening. I waited. I knew this game, the opener that invites you to apologize, to take the blame. When I said nothing, he finally looked up, his eyes holding a practiced expression of disappointment. "Leonard Hale is our single most important client, Sarah. You know this. His company holds its annual holiday party here. His personal account last year alone was significant." He let the word hang in the air. He put his hand on my back, I said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. "I understand he can be familiar," David said, waving a dismissive hand. "He's from an older generation. It's just his way of being friendly." Just being friendly. The phrase was a shield. "It wasn't friendly," I said, my voice quiet but firm. His hand was on the small of my back. It was possessive. David sighed, a long-suffering sound. "Perception is a tricky thing, Sarah. What you perceive as possessive, he might perceive as a supportive gesture. The optics of you pulling away like that, it was very abrupt. It made him feel embarrassed. It made another guest feel uncomfortable." My mind snagged on that. The other guest was uncomfortable because of what he did, not what I did. "That's your interpretation," he said, his tone shifting. It was colder now, the corporate mask was slipping. "My interpretation is that I have a major client who felt he was publicly rebuffed by a member of my staff, after I specifically instructed you to make him feel special." There it was. The instruction, the cage I was meant to live in. It had been an order to provide good service, then a justification for late nights, then a reason to endure personal questions. Now it was a weapon to be used against me. "Making him feel special is not in my job description," I said, and I felt a tremor of something new inside me. Not fear, but a cold, hard anger. "Preventing a customer from putting his hands on me is?" David pushed himself off the desk. He walked around it and sat down, creating a barrier between us. He started shuffling papers, a clear signal that the conversation was over. He was dismissing me. "Your job is to follow the direction of your manager," he said, his eyes fixed on a Z report. "Your job is to be a team player. You were told to keep him happy. Instead, you created a scene. You failed to use your judgment." I stood there, frozen. Every euphemism was a brick in a wall he was building around me. Team player, judgment, keep him happy. He was speaking a language I refused to learn. "He asked me to sit at his table," I said, my voice dangerously low. "That is a fireable offense. You told me to consider it. He touched me in a way that was not appropriate, and now you're telling me I fail?" David finally looked at me. His face was a blank wall. There was no empathy there. There was no concern for my safety. There was only risk assessment. I wasn't an employee to him. I was a liability. "Your job was to make him feel special, Sarah," he said, and the words landed like stones, "not to make him feel judged." That was it. That was the moment the floor fell out from under me, the belief I'd clung to, that if I just followed the rules, if I was professional enough, competent enough, that the system would protect me, crumbled into dust. The rules were not a shield. They were a cage, and I was being punished for rattling the bars. "I see," I said. The heat in my chest had turned to ice. "I think it's best if you take a few days off the schedule," David said, still not looking at me. He picked up a pen. "We need to let this cool down. I'll call you when we have shifts for you." It wasn't a suspension. It was a slow, quiet execution. Lose shifts, then lose more. Then your name just stops appearing on the schedule at all. It was the coward's way of firing someone. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of his office, closing the door softly behind me. I walked through the empty dining room. The chairs were stacked on the tables, their legs pointing at the ceiling like skeletons. The stage was empty. The performance was over. I collected my things from my locker, the slip of paper from the customer still tucked in my apron pocket. We saw that. It meant nothing now. There was no one to show it to. There was no court of appeals. There was only a manager's bottom line and the untouchable status of a rich man. Stepping out into the cool night air, I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel free. I felt hollowed out. I had done the right thing, the only thing I could do, and it had cost me everything. The job was just the beginning. The real price was the trust I'd had in the simple, transactional nature of the world. The belief that professionalism was armor. It wasn't, it was just a costume. And I had just been stripped of it. The click of the back door shutting behind me was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It wasn't a slam. It was a quiet, final latching that severed me from my life. One moment, I was a waitress. The next, I was just a woman standing in a dark alley that smelled of stale grease and bleach, holding a purse that suddenly felt too light. The cool night air felt foreign on my skin, a shock after the recycled, climate-controlled atmosphere of the restaurant. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, listening to the distant hum of city traffic, trying to make my lungs work. David's words echoed in the empty space where my thoughts should have been. You failed to follow my direction. You're not a team player. The corporate phrases he used as a shield were now the bricks of the wall he'd built between me and my job. I started walking, my sensible, non-slip work shoes, making quiet, rhythmic taps on the pavement. I didn't have a destination. I was just moving away from that door. Each step was a small act of defiance, a refusal to shatter right there in the alley. My mind was a frantic blur of calculations. How much was in my checking account? When was rent due? Could I cancel my cable? The practicalities were a strange comfort, a set of problems with actual solutions, unlike the one I had just left. When I finally reached my apartment building, my hand was shaking so badly I could barely fit the key in the lock. Inside, the silence was absolute. It was a stark contrast to the constant low-grade chaos of the restaurant, like the clatter of plates, the murmur of conversation, the quiet hum of the ice machine. My apartment was my sanctuary, but tonight it felt like a holding cell. I dropped my purse on the small entryway table and walked into the living room, still wearing my uniform. The crisp black shirt and apron felt like a costume from a play that had just ended. I had always taken pride in it, in the professionalism it represented. Now it felt like a mark of shame. I had followed the rules, all of them, until the rules were designed to break me. The ultimate instruction had been to make him feel special. I had failed because I refused to let him make me feel small. My fingers went to the apron ties, fumbling with the knot. As I pulled it off, I felt the crinkle of paper in the front pocket. I froze. The note, I had completely forgotten about it. My heart started a heavy, panic drumming against my ribs. I pulled it out. It was a simple, square piece of paper, torn from a small notepad. The handwriting was neat, masculine, and deliberate. We saw that. Underneath the 4 words was a phone number. I sank onto my sofa, the starched fabric of my work shirt rustling. I stared at the note, tracing the letters with my finger. We saw that. It was validation. It was proof. I hadn't imagined the pressure of his hand, the possessive way it settled on the curve of my back. I hadn't overreacted. Someone else, a stranger, had looked at the exact same moment and seen what I had felt. A violation, a wave of something hot and sharp, something that felt dangerously like hope, washed through me. But it was followed almost immediately by a cold tide of fear. What did this even mean? What was I supposed to do with a phone number from a man I didn't know? Call him and say what? Hello, you saw my boss enable my harassment and then fire me for not taking it. What's for dinner? It was absurd. He was probably long gone, back to his own life. The note a fleeting gesture of sympathy, a story he might tell his wife over a glass of wine. You'll never believe what we saw at dinner tonight. And that would be the end of it. People had their own lives to live. They didn't get involved in the messy, inconvenient dramas of strangers. I placed a note on my coffee table, right next to a pile of mail I hadn't opened. Bills, a credit card offer, a flyer for a new yoga studio, mundane pieces of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. I finally peeled off the uniform piece by piece and left it in a heap on the floor. I stood under the shower for a long time, the hot water stinging my skin, but it couldn't wash away the feeling of his hand. It was a ghost limb, a brand I could still feel through my skin, my shirt, everything. It wasn't a grab, it was worse. It was an act of ownership, done in public, a casual display of power that said, I can do this and no one will stop me. And he was right. David hadn't stopped him. He had punished me for resisting. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the last few weeks in a torturous loop. Every polite smile I'd forced. Every time I'd wiped down an already clean table to escape a conversation. Every evasive answer I'd given to his prying questions. I saw David's face, his eyes refusing to meet mine as he hid behind his paperwork. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had made a calculation and decided that my dignity was worth less than Leonard Hale's money. It was the simple, brutal math of the service industry. The next morning, the sun came up and I didn't have to go to work. The absence of my alarm felt like a physical blow. There was no routine to follow, no station to prep, no pre-shift meeting to attend. The day stretched before me, a terrifying, formless void. I made coffee, my movements slow and robotic. I sat at my small kitchen table and looked at the note again. We saw that. 4 words. It was a lifeline or a dead end. My first instinct was to survive. I needed a job. I could start looking online, polish my resume, call a few friends at other restaurants. I knew how to do that. It was a known path, a series of steps I understood. Calling this number was stepping off a cliff. It meant confronting what happened, speaking it out loud, making it real in a way that would be impossible to take back. It meant trusting a stranger. My trust in people felt like a shattered plate, and I didn't know how to glue the pieces back together. I spent the entire day in a state of paralysis, drifting from room to room. I'd pick up my phone, look at the number, and then set it back down. My thumb would hover over the call button, but a voice in my head, a voice that sounded a lot like David's, would whisper, "Don't be difficult, let it go, just move on." It was the voice of complicity, the voice that tells you to accept the unacceptable because fighting it is too much trouble. It was late afternoon when I found myself standing in front of my closet. My uniforms were all there, hanging in a neat row, clean and pressed, ready for shifts I would never work. I looked at them, at the years of my life they represented, the long hours, the sore feet, the missed holidays. I had given that place my loyalty. I had followed their rules, and in the end, they had told me my safety wasn't part of the deal. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, cold hardening. It was the realization that doing nothing was a choice. It was a choice to agree with them, to agree that what happened was acceptable, to agree that I was the one who was wrong. I walked back to the coffee table, my steps firm. I picked up my phone. I picked up the note. My hands were steady now. I wasn't thinking about what would happen if I called anymore. I was thinking about what would happen if I didn't. I would carry this shame and anger with me to the next job, and the one after that. It would curdle inside me, poisoning everything. Leonard Hale would keep his special table, David would keep his profits, and I would be gone. Another disposable part in their machine. No. I dialed the number. It rang twice. My throat was so dry I didn't think I could speak. A man's voice answered, calm and professional. "Hello?" I took a breath. "Hello," I said, my own voice a reedy whisper. I was given your number last night at the restaurant." There was a brief pause on the other end, but it wasn't a pause of confusion. It felt like a moment of consideration. "Yes," the man said, his voice even and kind. "I was hoping you'd call." The relief was so sudden and so immense it almost buckled my knees. I leaned against the wall for support. "My wife and I," he continued, "we were at the table next to you. We saw what happened. Not just last night, but the other times as well." Tears pricked my eyes. Hot, angry, grateful tears. "I'm so sorry you went through that," he said, and his sincerity was a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still open. "What your manager did was not only wrong, it was illegal." I swallowed hard, finding my voice. "He fired me." "I know," the man said softly. I suspected he would. He paused again, and when he spoke next, his tone shifted, becoming more solid, more focused. "My name is Arthur Vance. I'm a lawyer." The silence on my end of the line stretched, thick and heavy. I was holding my breath, my knuckles white where I gripped the phone. In my mind, I saw a dozen scenarios play out. It was a prank. It was one of Hale's friends, another turn in some cruel game. It was a trap. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said again, his voice patient, measured. It was a voice accustomed to waiting for people to catch up. "I was sitting at table 12 on Saturday night. I was hoping you'd call." I finally managed to push a word out. "Why?" It came out as a croak. I cleared my throat, trying to sound less like a cornered animal. "Because what I saw was wrong," he said, simply and without drama. There was no pity in his voice, only a statement of fact. It was like a splash of cold, clean water. "I saw Mr. Hale place his hand on your lower back. I saw you pull away. And I saw your manager, David, I believe, speak with you afterward. Your expression when you walked away from him? It was clear you weren't being supported." He saw. The words echoed the note. We saw that. For weeks I had felt invisible, like my discomfort was a figment of my own imagination, a secret shame only I could feel. But he had seen it. He had given it a name. He didn't say being friendly or making him feel special. He said wrong. He took me off the schedule, I whispered. The admission felt enormous, a final shameful confession. "I'm not surprised," Arthur Vance said, and the weariness in his tone told me he had seen this part of the story before too. "That's a common tactic. It's called retaliatory dismissal. It's easier than firing you for cause, and it's designed to make you just go away. Go away." That was exactly it. I was meant to evaporate, to become a non-person, another server who just didn't work out, who wasn't a team player. My mind was racing. I had spent my entire adult life following rules. You show up on time. You do your job well. You are polite. You don't cause trouble. I had followed every rule, and the system I believed in hadn't just failed to protect me. It had punished me for being the one who was wronged. Arthur Vance was offering a different set of rules. His words, retaliatory dismissal, were precise, legal. They were stones I could hold in my hand, not the smoke of David's corporate platitudes. What do you do?" I asked. "I'm a lawyer," he said. "I specialize in employment law, specifically cases like this." A lawyer. The word landed with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. It was too big, too serious. Lawyers were for other people, for dramatic television shows, for problems that were real and provable. My problem felt like a stain, something I could feel but couldn't show. It was his word against mine, and his word was backed by millions of dollars and the entire restaurant's payroll. "I can't afford a lawyer," I said. The sentence was automatic, a reflex. It was the truest thing I knew about my life. I lived in a world of counting tips and calculating if I could afford to fix the rattling sound in my car. "You don't have to," he said, his voice steady. "We can talk about that later. First, I'd like to suggest we meet. In person. I can explain your options. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do, Sarah. But you should at least know what your rights are." He used my name. I hadn't told him my name. A fresh spike of panic shot through me. "How did you know my name?" "Your name tag," he answered calmly. "And I asked the hostess when I left for the night. I told her I wanted to compliment your service. She was happy to confirm it. Of course, my name tag. Another part of the uniform, the friendly label that made me approachable, available. I felt a wave of nausea. He had been watching, planning, even then. But his plan wasn't to corner me. It was to offer me a lifeline. "Okay," I said, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. It was an act of rebellion. It was the first decision I had made for myself since this whole thing started. "Okay, I'll meet you." We settled on a time and place. A quiet coffee shop downtown, halfway between his office and my apartment. It was a neutral space. He was careful to make it clear that he was flexible, that the meeting was on my terms. When I hung up the phone, the silence of my apartment rushed back in, but it was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a terrifying electric hum of possibility. I walked into my small bedroom and opened the closet. My uniform was hanging there, neatly pressed. The black pants, the white shirt, the black apron folded over the hanger. I reached out and touched the sleeve of the shirt. For years, that uniform had been a source of pride. It meant I was capable, professional. It was the armor I wore to do a difficult job well. Now it looked like a costume for a part I could no longer play. The part of the smiling, accommodating, invisible woman. I took the hanger out of the closet, carried the uniform into the living room, and folded it. I didn't know what else to do. I laid it on the chair, the little plastic name tag with Sarah, in neat white letters glinting under the lamp. I sat on my sofa and stared at it. The instruction came back to me, David's voice in my head. Make him feel special. It was such a simple, innocuous phrase. It was a manager's job to say things like that, but it wasn't simple. It was a key. It was a key he had given to Leonard Hale, a key to unlock the rules, to unlock the professional distance I maintained, to unlock me. And when Hale had used the key, turning it until it broke the lock completely, David had blamed me for being in the way. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the ghost of Hale's hand on my back. The heat of it, the casual ownership in the gesture. It wasn't a grab. It wasn't violent. It was worse. It was an act of ownership done in public, a demonstration that he could touch me whenever and wherever he wanted, and that no one would stop him. That I wouldn't stop him. But I had pulled away. It was a small, reflexive jerk, a tightening of my whole body. But it was a rejection, and it had cost me my job. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of my closet for a long time. I pushed past the uniform and pulled out a pair of jeans and a simple blue sweater. They were my clothes, not a costume. I looked in the mirror. My face was pale, with dark circles under my eyes. I looked haunted. I looked like a woman who had just lost her job. I looked like a woman who was about to walk into a meeting with a lawyer. For the first time, it felt real. The coffee shop was busy, filled with the morning rush of people on their way to work. The smell of roasted beans and steamed milk was comforting, normal. I scanned the tables, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I was looking for a man who looked like he could slay dragons. Instead, I saw a man sitting alone at a small table in the corner, reading a newspaper. He was maybe 50, with graying hair and a face that was kind but tired. He wore a simple suit, the jacket draped over the back of his chair. He looked up as I hesitated by the door, and his eyes met mine. He gave a small, encouraging nod. It was him, Arthur Vance. He didn't look like a dragon slayer. He looked like a high school history teacher. I walked toward him, my legs feeling unsteady. He stood up as I approached, a gesture of respect that felt so foreign. I almost stopped in my tracks. Sarah, he asked quietly. Yes. Arthur Vance, thank you for coming, he said, extending his hand. I took it. His handshake was firm, dry, and brief. It was nothing like Hale's lingering, clammy touch. It was professional. It was safe. Please sit down, he said, gesturing to the chair. Can I get you a coffee? I'm fine, thank you, I said, sinking into the chair. My hands were trembling, so I clasped them in my lap. He sat down and folded his newspaper, setting it aside. He gave me his full attention. There was no paperwork, no phone, no distraction. He just looked at me, his expression patient. He wasn't rushing me. He was giving me the space to speak. The silence stretched, but this time it wasn't a void. It was an invitation. He had seen. He had listened. He had waited. Now it was my turn. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of coffee and a strange, unfamiliar freedom. He started coming in about 3 months ago, I began. And for the first time, I told the whole story. Arthur Vance's office was nothing like the restaurant. The restaurant was a world of dim lighting, rich mahogany, and the hushed, clinking sounds of expensive evenings. This office was a space of clean lines, pale wood, and quiet purpose. Sunlight, unfiltered by tinted windows, streamed in and lit up the dust motes dancing in the air. It was on the 12th floor, and through a large window, behind his desk, I could see the city laid out like a map. It made my world, which had shrunk to the size of a single dining room, feel vast again. He hadn't put me in a stiff client chair across a wide desk. Instead, we sat in 2 comfortable armchairs in a corner of the room, a small low table between us. It was a deliberate choice, I realized. It was meant to put me at ease. Coffee? Water? He asked. His voice was calm even. He was older than I'd first thought in the restaurant's low light, maybe in his early 50s, with kind eyes framed by faint lines and graying hair at his temples. He wore a simple blue shirt, no tie, the sleeves rolled to his forearms. Water would be great, thank you, I managed to say. My own voice sounded thin. He poured it for me from a glass pitcher on the table. He didn't say, take your time, or whenever you're ready." He just waited, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his attention fully on me. The silence wasn't pressuring, it was patient. It was a form of respect I hadn't been shown in months. I took a sip of water. The glass felt cool and solid in my trembling hands. "He said you're a lawyer," I began, the words feeling clumsy. "My wife and I are both lawyers," he corrected gently. "She was with me that night. We both saw it." "Estaré." The word landed like a rescue line. For so long it had just been I saw, I felt, I knew. Now there was a we. "I don't really know where to start," I confessed, looking down at the condensation on my glass. "The best place is usually the beginning," he said. "Tell me about your job at the restaurant. Tell me about Leonard Hale." So I did. I started with the day David had first pulled me aside. I recited the instruction, the one that had become the central pillar of my life for the last few months. He told me to make him feel special. I watched Arthur Vance's face for any sign of dismissal, any hint that this sounded trivial. There was none. He just nodded, his gaze steady, and made a small note on a yellow legal pad. I told him about the first night, how Hale had kept me there for 2 hours after we'd closed, asking me questions while I wiped down already clean tables. I described the slow, methodical way he'd learned the details of my life. Where I lived, that I was unmarried, that I had no children. Each question had felt like a small stone being placed on a scale, a gradual, imperceptible increase in weight. "Did you tell your manager about this?" he asked his first interruption. It wasn't an accusation, just a point of clarification. "I tried," I said, and the weariness washed over me again. "David, that's my manager. He just said that Mr. Hale was our most important client. He said he was just being friendly. He asked me not to be difficult." I saw Arthur's pen move again. Not to be difficult. I continued, the story tumbling out now, a chronological recounting of a slow-motion disaster. I told him about the gifts, the expensive perfume I never wore, left on the table with the tip, the silk scarf. I explained how refusing them wasn't an option, how David had told me it would be rude, an insult. "Use your judgment, Sarah," he'd said, a phrase that meant, "This is your problem, not mine." I described the way Hale's presence began to change the air in the restaurant. The other servers would trade sections with me without being asked, their eyes a mixture of pity and relief. They knew, but knowing and speaking were two different things. Speaking meant you could lose shifts. Speaking meant you weren't a team player. Speaking was a fireable offense, even if it wasn't written down anywhere. My voice started to shake when I got to the touching. I explained how it started. A hand on my arm to get my attention held just a second too long. His fingers brushing mine when he handed me his credit card. I felt a hot flush of shame, as if I were describing my own failure. "These things sound so small when I say them out loud," I said, my voice cracking. "I feel like I'm crazy." "You're not crazy," Arthur said, his voice firm but gentle. "This is a pattern. It's a deliberate escalation. He was testing your boundaries, and each time you couldn't enforce one, he pushed a little further. He was enabled by your manager. He had given my murky, suffocating feelings a name. A pattern, a deliberate escalation. It wasn't a series of unfortunate, disconnected moments. It was a strategy." I took a deep breath and forced myself to get to the end. Last week, he was at his usual table. The dining room was full. I was taking an order from the next table over. I felt his hand. I stopped, pressing my lips together. I didn't want to cry in a lawyer's office. I was a professional. "Where did he touch you, Sarah?" Arthur asked quietly. "On my lower back," I whispered. It wasn't a pat. It was his whole hand just resting there, like he was claiming something, like I was a piece of his furniture. My own words surprised me. An act of ownership. That's what it was. I froze, and then I pulled away. I couldn't help it. It was instinct. I looked up at him, my eyes pleading for him to understand. I didn't make a sound. I didn't say anything. I just moved away from him. But he noticed. He got this cold look on his face. Arthur Vance's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were dark with focus. "My wife and I saw that part," he said. "We saw you move. We saw his face change. We saw you go talk to your manager afterward. David pulled me into his office at the end of the night, I said, my voice flat now, all the emotion drained out of it. He didn't look at me. He was busy with the paperwork, shuffling stacks of receipts. He said Mr. Hale had been displeased. He said I had embarrassed him in the restaurant. Then he told me not to bother checking the schedule for next week. He said he'd call me if anything opened up. I finished. The whole ugly story was laid out between us in the quiet, sunlit room. I felt hollowed out, exhausted, but I also felt lighter. The story was no longer just mine to carry. Arthur set his pen down. For a long moment, he just looked at me. "Thank you for telling me that, Sarah," he said finally. "I know how difficult that was. What you've described here is a textbook case of a hostile work environment created by a third party in this case, a customer and enabled and ratified by your employer. When you complained and they did nothing to stop it, the restaurant became legally responsible for Hale's behavior. When they fired you for your reaction to being touched, that was illegal retaliation. It's as clear as anything I've ever seen. Hostile work environment, illegal retaliation. The words were like steel beams, giving structure and solidness to the fog of anxiety and fear I'd been living in. What had happened to me wasn't just unfair. It wasn't just me being difficult. It was illegal. "What does that mean?" I asked. "What can I do?" "It means you have a strong case," he said, leaning forward slightly. "We have options. The first step would be for me to draft a letter to the restaurant's ownership, laying out the facts and demanding a settlement. They may want to resolve this quietly. If they don't, we can file a formal complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a necessary step before we can file a lawsuit." A lawsuit, the word hung in the air, enormous and terrifying. Me, a waitress, suing a powerful man and a restaurant that catered to the city's elite. It seemed impossible. "They'll fight it," I said. "They'll say I'm lying, that I'm just after money." "They will," he agreed, his face serious. "They will try to discredit you. They will dig into your life. It will be difficult and stressful. I won't lie to you about that, but you are not lying, and you are not alone. My wife and I are witnesses to the culminating event." "Were there any other employees who saw Mr. Hale's behavior over the months?" I thought of Maria, her averted eyes. I thought of the busboys who made themselves scarce. "They saw, but I don't know if they would ever say anything. They need their jobs." "I understand," Arthur said. "We start with what we have. We have your testimony, which is credible and consistent, and we have me and my wife. It's a very strong start." He looked at me, his expression shifting from lawyer to human being. "Sarah, this is your decision. You don't have to do anything, but what they did to you was wrong. They counted on you being too scared and too isolated to fight back. They believe the rules don't apply to them, and you have an opportunity to show them that they do." I looked out the window at the sprawling city. For months, I had felt like a ghost haunting a single room in one of those buildings. I had followed all the rules, and it had gotten me nowhere. My belief in the system, in fairness, had been systematically dismantled. David and Leonard Hale had taken my job, my sense of safety, and my trust in people. I'm still trying to figure out how to get that back, but as I sat there, in that quiet office, I realized this was the first step. It wasn't about the money, it was about the fact that they couldn't just do this. They couldn't break a person and then just throw her away like a used napkin. I turned back to Arthur Vance, my spine a little straighter than it had been when I walked in. The hollow feeling inside me was being replaced by something else, something hard and unfamiliar. It felt like resolve. "Okay," I said, my voice clear and steady for the first time all day. "Let's show them." I hung up the phone, and for a long moment, I just stood there in my small living room. The receiver felt impossibly heavy in my hand before I finally placed it back in its cradle. My knuckles were white. The silence that followed was louder than the conversation itself. A hostile work environment. Illegal retaliation. Arthur Vance had given my experience a name. He had taken the vague, creeping dread that had lived in my stomach for months and given it a shape, a definition, a legal weight. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It wasn't just me being difficult. It was a thing, a real and actionable thing. The relief was so sharp, it felt like pain. It was followed immediately by a wave of pure terror. I had said yes. I had agreed to fight. I had no idea what that meant. My hand was shaking as I reached for a pen and a blank notebook from the junk drawer in my kitchen. Arthur's first instruction had been simple, direct. Write it all down, Sarah. Everything you can remember. Start from the beginning. Dates, times, specific phrases, what he said, what David said. Don't filter it. Don't judge it. Just write it. It felt like an order, and after months of taking them, my body knew how to obey. I sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I ate my solitary meals after shifts, and I opened the notebook. The first page was stark white. For a minute, I couldn't think of a single thing to write. My mind, which had been replaying these moments in an endless, torturous loop, was suddenly empty. It was a defense mechanism, I realized, a final attempt to protect me from what I was about to do. I forced the pen to the paper. My first entry was the instruction itself. David told me to make him feel special. The words looked small on the page, almost innocent, but as I stared at them, the rest came flooding back. I wrote about the first night, the way Leonard Hale had held my gaze for too long, the questions that were too personal. Are you married? Do you have kids? You seem too smart for this job. I wrote down how I had deflected, how I had kept my smile fixed and my answers vague, a well-practiced drill. I filled pages with the late nights. The restaurant, empty and echoing, with just the two of us. Me wiping down already clean tables, refilling his water, waiting. Him talking about his business, his ex-wives, his own loneliness. It was a performance of intimacy, and I was the captive audience. I wrote down the gifts, the perfume that I never wore, the silk scarf that felt like a brand. I noted how I had tried to refuse and how David had pulled me aside the next day. Don't embarrass our guests, Sarah. It's just a friendly gesture. The pen scratched across the paper, a frantic, ugly sound. I wrote about the day David took me off the schedule for a Saturday night shift because Mr. Hale preferred me on Tuesdays. I wrote about the loss of income, the quiet shunning from my coworkers who wanted those lucrative shifts. I was becoming isolated, set apart. I was Hale's waitress. That was my new identity. Finally, I got to the touching. The first time his hand brushed mine as I set down his glass. It was nothing, a flicker of contact, but it sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Then the hand that rested on my arm, just for a second, too long, as he thanked me. Each incident was a test, a new boundary being gently, deliberately erased. I described them in flat, declarative sentences. He put his hand on my arm. He touched my hair. He stood too close. When I reached the final night, my handwriting was nearly illegible. He put his hand on my lower back. I stopped writing. I didn't need to describe the feeling. It was seared into my skin. It wasn't a pat. It wasn't a friendly guide. It was a claim. An act of ownership performed in public for everyone to see. I wrote down my reaction. I pulled away. Then David's words in his office, his face a mask of disappointment. You embarrassed him. You embarrassed me. I closed the notebook. It was hours later. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across my floor. The book felt radioactive, a dense, heavy catalog of my own humiliation. But it was also something else. It was evidence. 2 days later, I was sitting in Arthur Vance's office. It was on the 10th floor of a downtown building, a world away from the soft lighting and clinking glasses of the restaurant. Here, the lights were fluorescent, the coffee was mediocre, and the only sound was the quiet hum of a computer. The space was tidy, almost Spartan. The walls were lined with books, thick, leather-bound volumes with gold lettering. They were books of rules. It was the safest I had felt in months. Arthur was exactly as he had sounded on the phone. Calm, methodical, serious. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a crisp shirt and slacks. He looked more like a professor than the sharks I imagined lawyers to be. He'd read through my notebook, which I had handed over with the solemnity of a state secret. This is excellent, Sarah, he said, his voice even. He tapped the notebook. Your memory for detail, for the specific language David used, is crucial. Use your judgment. Don't be difficult. Keep him happy. This is the vocabulary of complicity. He was creating a situation where the company could benefit from the harassment while maintaining plausible deniability. They put you in an impossible position. Hearing him say it so plainly made my breath catch. He made me feel like I was the problem. That's the goal, Arthur said, his eyes meeting mine. There was no pity in them, only a steady professional focus. It's a classic tactic. It isolates the victim and protects the institution. Now, we need to talk about the next steps. I'm going to draft a demand letter to the restaurant's parent corporation. It will outline our claims: sexual harassment, hostile work environment, and retaliatory termination. It will state our intention to file a lawsuit if we don't receive a satisfactory response. A lawsuit. The word landed like a stone in the quiet office. What will they do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. They have two options, he explained, leaning forward slightly. They can recognize their exposure here is significant and move to settle this quietly and quickly. Or they can fight. They can try to discredit you. They will say you are a disgruntled employee. They will say you are lying for money. They will say you misinterpreted friendly gestures. They will try to make this your fault. I felt a cold dread return, the familiar feeling of being small and alone. I thought of Leonard Hale, of his easy confidence, his casual power. A man like that didn't get challenged. And Mr. Hale? I asked. He's the centerpiece, but he isn't who we're suing. We're suing your employer. They had a duty to protect you, and they failed. In fact, they facilitated the harassment for profit. Hale is the weapon, but the restaurant is the one who aimed it at you. He paused, which brings me to my next question. Witnesses. In your notebook, you mention other staff were present for many of these incidents. Maria, the other servers, the kitchen staff. Did anyone ever say anything to you? I thought of Maria's face, her eyes always finding something else to look at, a wine list, a smudge on a glass, the far wall. I thought of the busboys who would suddenly find urgent work on the other side of the room whenever Hale lingered at my station. Their silence was a language all its own. No, I said, the word tasting like ash. No one ever said anything. They saw. I know they saw. But they have jobs to protect, families. I can't... My voice trailed off. To ask them to speak for me felt like asking them to step into the same cage I had just escaped. Arthur nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this answer. I understand. It's a difficult position to put them in. But we may have to. Their testimony would be powerful. For now, we have something just as good. He gestured to the chair beside me. My wife, she saw it, and I saw it. We saw the hand on your back. We saw you recoil, and we saw the look on Hale's face afterward. It wasn't disappointment, it was annoyance. Like a toy that had suddenly stopped working. A toy that had stopped working. The description was so accurate, so dehumanizing, that it stole the air from my lungs. That's all I was. Okay, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. The image, as horrible as it was, had solidified something inside me. The last vestiges of self-blame crumbled away. Okay, what do you need me to do? For now, nothing. Just try to live your life, he said gently. This part is my job. I'll send the letter. They will have a week to respond. The ball will be in their court. He stood up, signaling the end of our meeting. Sarah, he added as I gathered my purse, I need you to be prepared. This is not a fast process, and it is not a painless one, but you are not alone in this anymore. I walked out of the high-rise and into the bright, indifferent afternoon. The city bustled around me, people rushing to meetings, to lunches, to their ordinary lives. For the first time in a year, I felt like I was one of them again. I was no longer just a waitress. I was no longer Leonard Hale's special project. I was a plaintiff. The word felt strange and heavy. A new role with a new costume I hadn't learned to wear yet. The path ahead was a fog, but for the first time I felt the ground beneath my feet. I had taken the first step, and I had not taken it alone. The line went dead, but I kept the phone pressed to my ear. The silence on the other end was a hollow space where a decade of my professional life used to be. Arthur Vance's voice still echoed in my head, calm and measured, slicing through the panic with words I didn't know I needed to hear. Hostile work environment, illegal retaliation. They were clinical, sterile terms for something that had felt so personal, so deeply shaming. I had a lawyer. I had a case. The thought didn't bring the triumphant surge of relief I might have expected. Instead, a different kind of dread, colder and more profound, settled in my stomach. This wasn't just about me and David and a man whose name was a liability. This was something else now. It was official. It would be documented. My name, my story would be typed onto letterhead and filed away in cabinets. I had wanted someone to see what happened, to acknowledge it. I just hadn't understood what it would mean to make that happen. 2 days later, I sat across from Arthur Vance in his office. It wasn't the intimidating glass and chrome fortress I had pictured. It was a modest space in a well-worn building downtown, smelling faintly of old paper and brewing coffee. The walls were lined with bookshelves, not awards, and the titles were a mix of legal tomes and history. Arthur himself was older than his voice on the phone suggested, maybe in his late 50s, with kind eyes crinkled at the corners and a tweed jacket that had seen better days. He looked less like a shark and more like a university professor. He slid a ceramic mug of coffee across the polished wood desk toward me. It was plain white, a stark contrast to the delicate gold-rimmed china of the restaurant. There was no saucer. "I take it black," he said, a simple statement. "Hope that's all right." I nodded, my hands wrapped around the warmth of the mug. "It's fine, thank you." "Sarah," he began, leaning back in his chair. It squeaked softly. "Before we dive in, I want to be clear about what this process looks like. It's not fast and it's not always pleasant. They will almost certainly try to paint you as a disgruntled employee, as difficult, as someone who couldn't handle the pressures of the job." I flinched. "Don't be difficult, Sarah." David's voice smooth and dismissive. Arthur saw it. His gaze was sharp, observant. "They'll use the very language your manager used to keep you in line. That's the playbook. My job is to make sure the facts speak louder than their narrative." He had me recount everything. From the very first night, when David had pulled me aside for that initial instruction. Saying it all out loud in that quiet room felt different. It wasn't a frantic, panicked story, whispered into the phone anymore. It was testimony. I told him about the late nights, the way Hale would hold me there with questions that felt like tiny, probing needles. I told him about the watch, the way my refusal was framed as an insult. I described the escalating casualness of his touch, a hand on my arm, a brush against my waist. And then I told him about that last night, the weight of Hale's hand on the small of my back. It wasn't a grab, it was an act of ownership, done in the open in front of a full dining room. It was a declaration that the rules didn't apply to him, and by extension, to me. "I just pulled away," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It was instinct. I didn't make a scene. I just moved." "You moved out of his reach," Arthur clarified, jotting a note on a yellow legal pad. He didn't look up. "You reclaimed your personal space." I'd never thought of it that way. I had only thought of my fireable offense. The way David's face had contorted in a mask of cold fury. The walk to his office, the silent, well-practiced drills of the other servers continuing around us as if my world wasn't collapsing. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy. Arthur set his pen down, placing it perfectly parallel to the edge of the pad. He looked at me directly, and for the first time since this all began, I felt completely seen. Not as a problem to be managed, not as an object to be placated, but as a person. "They left you no other option," he said, his voice firm. "Every step of the way, you tried to do your job. You tried to handle it professionally. You reported your discomfort. Your manager was not only negligent, he was complicit. He actively facilitated the harassment because it was profitable. When you finally asserted a boundary you were entitled to, he terminated you to protect the client. It's a textbook case, Sarah." He spent the next hour explaining the first step. It was called a demand letter. "It's an opening move," he explained. "We lay out the facts of the case, the laws that were broken, and what we are demanding to resolve the matter before a lawsuit is filed. In your case, that includes lost wages, damages for emotional distress, and my legal fees. We send it to the restaurant's corporate parent, a company called Sterling Hospitality Group." Sterling Hospitality. I'd seen the name on the bottom of my paychecks. It was a faceless entity, a logo on a corporate website. It felt impossible that they would care about a waitress in one of their dozens of establishments. "What will they do?" I asked. "They'll send it to their lawyers," Arthur said. "Their lawyers will likely conduct a sham internal investigation. They'll interview David. He will lie. He'll say you were a poor performer, that Mr. Hale was just being friendly, that you overreacted. They might try to get a statement from Hale, but I doubt it. Men like him don't get involved in the messy details. They pay people to make problems disappear. The words sent a chill through me. Make him feel special. It was all the same transaction, just on a different scale. A week later, I was back in his office. A document was waiting on the desk. Arthur pushed it toward me. This is the draft of the demand letter. I need you to read it carefully. Make sure every fact is correct. Then, if you're ready, you'll sign it and we'll send it. I picked it up. It was 3 pages of dense, single-spaced text. My name was at the top, under the heading Re, Wrongful Termination and Hostile Work Environment Claim of Sarah Jenkins. Reading it was a surreal experience. My life, my anxiety, my dread from the past few months had been translated into a foreign language. It was all there, but stripped of emotion and rendered in cold, hard facts. On or about October 12th, Ms. Jenkins's manager, David Choi, instructed her to provide special treatment to a client, Mr. Leonard Hale, a directive that was understood to mean she should accommodate any and all of the client's requests, regardless of professional boundaries. Mr. Hale established a pattern of behavior that constituted quid pro quo harassment, creating an environment where Ms. Jenkins believed her continued employment was contingent on her tolerance of his unwanted personal advances. The harassment culminated on December 4th, when Mr. Hale engaged in unwelcome and non-consensual physical contact with Ms. Jenkins in the main dining room. When Ms. Jenkins recoiled from this contact, she was summarily terminated by Mr. Choi in an act of illegal retaliation. The instruction to make him feel special was there, quoted in stark. The watch was there. The hand on my back was there. It was all real. It wasn't just a feeling I had. It wasn't me being difficult. It was a sequence of events that, when written down in the dispassionate language of the law, was undeniable. It made my breath catch. This document was the truth, hammered into a weapon. "Is it accurate?" Arthur asked gently. I could only nod, unable to speak. I thought of my old co-workers, of Maria, who had looked at me with pity that last night. Would they ever speak up? Or would they fall in line, protecting the paychecks that paid their rent, just as I had for as long as I could? I couldn't blame them if they did. The system was designed for their silence. Arthur pointed to the last page. "You'll sign here." I picked up the pen. For a moment, I thought of David's smug face, of Leonard Hale's casual, possessive smile. I thought of the years I had spent perfecting my craft, taking pride in the invisible, seamless service I provided. They had taken that from me. They had twisted my professionalism into a trap. I didn't know if I would ever get that back. But this was something. It wasn't a plea, it was a demand. My hand was steady. It surprised me. I signed my name. Arthur took the pages and slid them into a crisp envelope addressed to the legal department of Sterling Hospitality Group. The sound of the paper sliding in felt final, like a door locking. "Okay," he said, his voice all business again. "It's sent. Now we wait." I walked out of his office and into the anonymous afternoon bustle of the city. The world was moving on. People were heading home from work, laughing, talking on their phones. My world had stopped. It was now held in suspension, inside that envelope, making its way to a desk in a building I'd never see. The ball was in their court now, and the silence that followed was louder than any conversation I'd ever had in that dining room. The weight of the pen in my hand disappeared, but a different kind of heaviness settled in my stomach. Arthur Vance took the signed document, his movements crisp and professional. He slid it into a thick manila envelope, the paper making a soft, definitive rasp. It was done. I had officially pushed back. "I'll have this sent by courier first thing in the morning," he said, his voice even. He looked at me, his gaze holding none of the pity I dreaded. It was just steady. "They'll have it before lunch." I nodded, unable to form a word. My throat felt tight, as if I'd swallowed a stone. I had spent my entire working life following rules, keeping my head down, and believing that doing a good job was its own protection. Now I had signed a piece of paper that declared war on a system I had tried so hard to appease. Leaving his quiet, orderly office felt like stepping off a cliff. The city air was thick with exhaust and the late afternoon hum of traffic. For a moment, I just stood on the sidewalk, a ghost in the river of people flowing past me. They all had places to be, offices, homes, appointments. I had nowhere. My routine, the one that had structured my days for years, had been obliterated. There was no uniform to press, no pre-shift meeting to attend, no tables to set. There was only the waiting. The first few days were the worst. I woke up at 6 a.m. out of habit, my body tensed for a long shift on my feet. But there was nowhere to go. The silence in my small apartment was immense. It was a physical presence pressing in on me. I'd make coffee and sit at my tiny kitchen table staring at the wall. My laptop sat open on the table, a constant temptation. I resisted the urge to look up the restaurant to see if they'd posted my job opening. I resisted looking up Leonard Hale's name. I knew what I would find, a sea of articles about his philanthropy, his brilliant investments, his untouchable success. A world away from a waitress, he had decided to break for sport. My world had shrunk to the four walls of my apartment and the screen of my phone. I checked my email a dozen times an hour, then 24. I knew Arthur had said it would take time, but my mind had latched onto his words. They'll have it before lunch. I kept picturing a team of lawyers in a glass-walled conference room, passing my letter around, maybe even laughing. A waitress against sterling hospitality? The thought was a cold spike of dread. What had I done? I was a single person with a dwindling savings account. They were a corporate giant with a legal department that probably had its own zip code. David's words echoed in my head, twisted into a new, more menacing shape. Don't be difficult. I was being difficult on a scale I couldn't even comprehend. I tried to be productive. I polished my resume, the words feeling like a lie. Excellent customer service skills. Thrives in a fast-paced environment, team player. That last one felt like a sick joke. How could I explain the gap? I was fired for refusing to be harassed by a millionaire. It sounded hysterical. It sounded unbelievable. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing that would get my resume tossed in the trash. After a week of silence, the anxiety began to curdle into a kind of dull, grinding despair. The adrenaline from my meeting with Arthur had faded, leaving behind the stark reality of my situation. I was unemployed, isolated, and locked in a battle I couldn't see. It was all happening in emails and phone calls between lawyers, in a language I didn't speak. I was the subject of the conversation, but I wasn't in the room. I had never been in the room. On the 10th day, my phone finally rang with a number I didn't recognize. My heart seized. I answered, my hand trembling. "Sarah Jenkins?" a clipped female voice asked. "Yes." "This is Maria from City Temp Agency. We received your application. I have a possible short-term placement, data entry, if you're interested." The relief was so sharp it felt like disappointment. "Oh, yes. Thank you," I stammered. I took down the details, my mind a million miles away, data entry. It was something. It was hours to fill. It was a paycheck, however small. It was a reason to leave the apartment. The next morning, Arthur Vance called. "Sarah, good morning. I have their response," he said. His voice was the same as always, calm, measured. But I heard the lack of warmth. It was the voice of a person delivering bad news. I sat down on the edge of my sofa. "Okay. It's a standard first response for a case like this. It's designed to be intimidating. I want you to be prepared for that. Just tell me, Arthur." "They deny everything," he said, and the floor dropped out from under me. "They deny the hostile work environment claim. They deny the illegal retaliation. They state that your termination was, and I'm quoting here, the culmination of a documented pattern of insubordination and unprofessional conduct." I couldn't breathe. Documented? I had never had a single write-up, not one. My employee file was pristine. I knew it was. "What documentation?" I asked, my voice thin. "They don't specify. They don't have to at this stage. It's a threat, Sarah. They're manufacturing a history for you." He continued, his voice a low, steady drone against the roaring in my ears. He said their lawyers, a firm named Halstead and Croft, had painted a specific picture. They claimed my interactions with Mr. Hale were consistently unprofessional. They suggested I was overly familiar and that other staff members had noted my inappropriate and attention-seeking behavior. The words hit me like stones. In their version of the story, I wasn't the victim. I was the predator. I was the one who had crossed the line. The instruction, "make him feel special," was gone, erased. In its place was a story where I had pursued him, and when my advances were rebuffed, I had become difficult. My pulling away from his touch was now framed as a public theatrical display of insubordination designed to embarrass a valued client. It was David's narrative, polished and weaponized by a team of expensive lawyers. Every corporate euphemism he had ever used was now a legal position. My desire to do my job was attention-seeking. My discomfort was unprofessional conduct. My refusal to be owned was insubordination. "They're lying," I whispered. It was such a small, stupid word for such a monumental deception. "Yes," Arthur said simply. "They are. They also claim that David Choi counseled you on multiple occasions about your performance, and that you were dismissive of his feedback." I thought of David in his office, staring at his paperwork, refusing to meet my eyes. I thought of him telling me to use my judgment, to just be friendly. Those weren't counseling sessions. They were instructions. They were a cage. "And Hale?" I asked, the name tasting like ash. "What do they say about him?" "They position him as the victim of your behavior," Arthur said. There was a pause. "They also included a final paragraph. It's not an explicit threat, but the intent is clear. They state that Sterling Hospitality and Mr. Hale reserve the right to pursue all available legal remedies to protect their reputations from defamatory and baseless accusations." A countersuit. They were threatening to sue me for telling the truth. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, the phone pressed hard against my ear. The world had tilted on its axis. It wasn't just that they were refusing to take responsibility. They were trying to rewrite my reality. They were trying to erase me and build a monster in my place. They had taken my professionalism, my desire to do things by the book, and twisted it into a weapon to use against me. The system wasn't just broken. It was an engine designed to crush people like me. For 10 days, I had been afraid. I had been anxious. I had felt small and powerless. But listening to Arthur read the summary of their lies, something else began to bubble up from the cold pit of my stomach. It was hot and sharp. It was fury. They thought I was difficult. They had no idea. "Sarah, are you still there?" Arthur's voice cut through the haze. I took a slow, deep breath, the first one that felt like it reached my lungs all week. The shaking in my hands had stopped. A cold, hard clarity settled over me. They had left me no room to retreat. They had left me no option. "I'm here," I said, and my own voice surprised me. It was steady, it was clear. "What's our next move?" The paper felt heavy in my hands, weighted with more than just the ink and the legalese. It was a tangible piece of their reality, a world where my service was insubordination and my fear was an attack. What the cold resolve I'd felt moments before didn't vanish. It hardened, settling deep in my bones like a winter frost. Arthur Vance watched me, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer empty comforts. He simply waited, giving me the space to process the blow. "They're saying I'm the one who was out of line," I said, my voice flat. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, the first step in understanding the new terrain of this fight. "This is what they do, Sarah," he replied, his tone even. He gestured to the letter on the table between us. "This isn't a search for the truth. It's a strategy. They build a counter-narrative. They create a version of you that is unreliable, difficult, a problem employee. They are banking on the idea that you will be too scared, too exhausted, or too poor to fight it." I looked down at my own hands, resting on the worn wood of his conference table. They were a waitress's hands, with small faded scars from oven racks and a faint roughness to the palms. They were hands that had carried thousands of plates, wiped down hundreds of tables, and cashed out countless checks. They were not the hands of a difficult person, but the letter claimed otherwise. It claimed there was a file, a history, a fiction. "What happens now?" I asked. Arthur leaned forward, folding his own hands. "Now we file. We move past demand letters and into formal litigation. But I need you to understand what that means. It's not like on television. It's slow, it's invasive, and it will be ugly." He explained the process, discovery. The word sounded clean, academic. Arthur described it as a slow, methodical invasion. They would request my employment history, my text messages, my emails. They would try to find anything, a complaint about a previous boss, a frustrated text to a friend, a late payment on a credit card to paint a picture of me as unstable or greedy. They will put your life under a microscope, he said, his gaze direct. Their goal is to break you before you ever see the inside of a courtroom. They will depose you, which means their lawyers will question you for hours. They will ask the same questions over and over, trying to trip you up. They'll ask you what you were wearing, if you had been drinking, if you'd ever flirted with a customer before. They will try to make you feel ashamed. I felt a surge of the old, familiar dread, the same feeling I'd had when I saw Leonard Hale's car pull up to the restaurant. It was the feeling of a boundary being tested, of a space I thought was safe being violated. The restaurant had been a cage. This lawsuit was shaping up to be another one, just with different bars. And what do we get to do? I asked, the words tasting like ash. We do the same to them, Arthur said, a flicker of steel in his eyes. We request Hale's reservation history. We request every email and internal message that mentions you or him. We demand the personnel files of every waitress who has ever been assigned to his section. We ask for David Choi's performance reviews and his bonus structure. We find out exactly how much money Leonard Hale was worth to that restaurant. He was talking about turning their microscope back on them. The idea offered a sliver of satisfaction, but it was buried under a mountain of exhaustion. There were other people who saw it, I said, thinking of the silent, well-practiced way my co-workers would suddenly need to be at the service bar, or in the kitchen whenever Hale got too familiar. Chloe, Maria, they saw him. They saw David ignore it. Arthur's expression softened. Will they testify? I thought of Maria, a single mother who was always worried about losing shifts. I thought of Chloe, who was paying her way through night school and couldn't afford to make waves. We all knew the rules, the unspoken ones. Don't be difficult. Don't be a liability. The customer, especially that customer, was always right. No, I said, the word coming out quieter than I intended. They can't. It would cost them their jobs. It cost me mine just for pulling away from a man's touch. What would it cost them to speak up voluntarily? Or rent was due on the 1st. I couldn't blame them for their silence. It was the price of survival. I understand, Arthur said. We'll proceed as if we're on our own. He was right. I was on my own. It was the same cold, sinking feeling I'd had standing in David's office, the words "you embarrassed him" echoing in the small space. My manager hadn't looked at me then, and my co-workers hadn't been able to meet my eyes as I'd packed my locker. It was an act of collective looking away. The meeting ended. Arthur gave me a list of things he needed and told me to get some rest. Rest felt like a distant country I no longer had a passport for. I walked home through a city that suddenly felt alien. The routines that had structured my life, the pre-shift meal, the walk to work, the familiar weight of an apron were gone. My apartment was quiet, too quiet. For years, the silence of my own home had been a welcome reprieve from the constant noise of the restaurant. Now it felt like an accusation. I spent the next few days in a daze, gathering pay stubs and old schedules. My body still operated on restaurant time. I'd wake up with a jolt of anxiety at 4 p.m., my internal clock screaming that I was late for my shift. My hands knew the rhythm of tying an apron I no longer owned. I kept replaying David's words, Hale's casual touch, the smug legal phrasing of the company's letter. Use your judgment, keep him happy, not a team player. The phrases looped in my head, a corporate-sponsored gaslighting. They were trying to make me doubt my own memory, to make me believe that the fault was mine. And the most terrifying part was that a small, exhausted piece of me wanted to believe them. It would be easier. If it was my fault, I could fix it. I could learn from it. But if it wasn't my fault, then the world was a place where you could do everything right and still be punished. That was a much harder truth to live with. On the 3rd night, my phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. It was late after 10. The only people who called me that late were people from work, after cashing out, ready to complain or celebrate. A wave of loneliness, sharp and sudden, washed over me. I answered, Shai. Hello? There was a pause. Sarah, it's Maria. Her voice was hushed, strained. I could hear the faint clatter of dishes in the background. She must have been in the back, near the dish pit, the one place you could have a semi-private conversation. Maria, I said, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Is everything okay? I can't talk long, she said, the words stumbling over each other in a rush. David has everyone on edge. He had a big meeting with corporate today. Everyone's walking on eggshells. About me? Yes. No. I don't know, she stammered. Listen, I can't get involved. My sister watches my son, and if I lose this job, I can't. I know, Maria. I wouldn't ask you to, I said, and I meant it. But it's not right, she whispered, and I could hear the frustration and fear warring in her voice. What they're doing, what David did. He's telling everyone you were on thin ice for weeks, that you'd been written up. I was never written up, I said, my voice cold and clear. Not once. I know, she said. That's why I'm calling. I heard him the day before it happened. He was in the kitchen talking to Chef Antoine. He was complaining about Chloe being late again. And he said, thank God for Sarah. She's the only one I can count on to handle the hail section without any drama. I froze. The silence on my end of the line stretched on. In the background, I heard someone shout an order and Maria gasped. I have to go, she said frantically. I'm sorry, Sarah, be careful. The line went dead. I stood in the middle of my silent living room, phone in hand. The city lights glowed through my window, distant and indifferent. The only one I can count on to handle the hail section without any drama. David's words, a direct contradiction to the fiction they were building, the story of the problem employee. It wasn't a smoking gun. It wasn't a signed confession. It was one frightened woman's memory of a conversation she wasn't supposed to have overheard. It was hearsay. It was probably useless in the court, but it wasn't useless to me. It was proof. It was the anchor I needed in the storm of their lies. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined his trust, his reliance on my professionalism. He hadn't seen me as a problem. He'd seen me as the solution, the perfect, quiet, uncomplaining girl to feed to the wolves. The frost in my bones shifted. It was no longer just a cold resolve. It was becoming something sharper. It was becoming a weapon.